amazing to be part of this panel and taking the classroom question in terms of what is access panel, what is online, and what is reverse sampling, and what are the new terms which are coming in. Now, I'll just take cue from what Rag said, that there are rituals in terms of building an online panel, which basically means that instead of knocking on the door every day, I prepare a ready-made pool of respondents in a population who have agreed to participate in online surveys for a longest time period. The advantage of online panels also allows you to collect a lot of pre-profiling data from these respondents. And one key difference between access panels versus reverse sampling is that in access panels, you're always invited to participate in a survey. So the sampling control still remains on a keyboard of one sampling expert for that matter. So you always invite using a registered email ID, using a login access, and you always check, okay, what was the date of birth that you had entered while you registered, right? And we all know how we enter our date of birth in online forms, right? It will always be 1st Jan 1982 if I'm too old, like in the current days. Reverse sampling is basically you remove these parameters or rituals and you go directly into the large access of internet traffic, right? You put your ads on places where a lot of people would be coming in, and you will invite them to participate in a survey in an uncontrolled or a direct manner, but you'll still ask a lot of profiling questions before you actually take them to a real survey. So that's the key difference between an access panel, which is managed, which is built for a purpose, and reverse sampling, which is more instant, more random traffic coming in from big publishers across the country, across the world.
Okay. Rags, having seen both the world, the face-to-face world, and more recently, you have been pretty intimately involved with the online data collection. What are your views, given your experience and understanding of the offline sampling? What is your perspective on the online sampling?
Yeah. Basically, Josh, two distinct parts to online sampling. But before that, Dushyant spoke about two kinds of routes in online world for eliciting or locating respondents. One is a panel, which is a managed panel, and the other is a riverside sampling where you sample kind of a thing. In both of these cases, in a managed panel, there is a large number of pool of people to whom, depending on your target group, exactly like in the real world, you need to target SECB, this age group, and this particular product category user. So you exactly send out, you may not have the product category usage information, but you have the SES and you have the state. So you send out an invite for them to participate. And essentially what you are doing is, and that portion you can do as random as anybody else in terms of in the real world. In fact, more random in the real world because you can get distribution. Because in a normal cluster sampling in the real world, you will select 50 starting points in Bombay. Whereas in this, I can actually select for 1,000 sample size, 1,000 random points where you can actually send out the invites. Essentially, I am knocking on a digital door for the person to respond. The fundamental difference is there I knock on a door and I assume that I am interviewing that person. Here, the person says if I send 1,000 invites, maybe some 80 people respond on day one, another 80 people respond on day two, and after some point of time, some people don't respond even with 2 reminders. So essentially, the person who is responding may not necessarily represent the universe that you sent it to. In that particular instance, that is the challenge in online panel, which is where three challenges are there, which is one is the representation of the segments of the proportions, AP proportions, income proportions, age proportions may not be the same as the universe because people are volunteering to respond. Then the second one is, again, because people are opting into response, is the opting in person different from the non-opting in person in that particular area? And the third is obviously in terms of it's a self-response. It is not somebody listening to your response. These are the fundamental difference between an offline world and an online world. In my opinion, starting point is much better in an online world because I get a much better spread compared to an offline world. The second is In fact, even in the earlier instance, when we had 50 starting points, 60 starting points, there are many instances when I had observed that the final data does not represent the universe that you wanted to represent. And therefore, we always do weighting. Here in the online world, you don't even assume representation. You will invariably always do weighting. To begin with, that weighting process takes care of the bulk of the problems. Then the second one is, and in the online world as well as the offline world, in both the cases, ultimately a respondent who's willing to participate alone participates in the study. Even in the offline world, the guy can shut the door. And in any case, you don't have access to a huge number of households. You can't even enter their doors. At least here, there is a chance that you have entered and somebody is participating. So to that extent, that is also not world of difference between the two. The most significant one is the consumer is responding himself. And in my experience, I had done a fair amount of self-administered questionnaire in the early days on very sensitive topics like family planning, condom usage, product testing on contraception, some of those areas. And I can vouch happily that saying self-response far superior to an interviewer asked and recorded response. And it eliminates a whole lot of interviewer questioning related issues. Interviewer normally hurries through a question. Here the question is out there too for him to see exactly it is. But that is the challenge, because here there is no interviewer intervention that you can hope can correct for researcher mistakes. So if your researcher has made a mistake, that will still exist. So to me, the comparison is largely not so relevant. I mean, bulk of whatever rigor that used to happen there, same extent or even more can happen here. And as reliable as it can be. There is fraud in both the cases, huh?
Yes, the different kinds of fraud, yes.
So that is a different thing that you need to manage. Yeah, you should control thieves, but otherwise science works both ways perfectly all right.
I think Rag's a very important point. See, one of the reservations some people have about online sampling is that it's a voluntary response, in the sense a lot of people don't want to respond. And we actually measure that. We know A, how many people join the panel, B, how many people respond. In the face-to-face world, the same thing used to happen and probably still happens. It's just that I don't think it's the industry practice to measure it. I'll just give you one or two examples where I was privy to. We actually found in a face-to-face, more than 50% of your target group respondents absolutely refuse. You couldn't even get past question one, right? So it's not that the face-to-face sampling was the gold standard, and we are struggling to keep up with it, because there were issues there which we didn't mention. But coming on that point, Dushyant, just to close this part of the, however, still, I mean, we know that in markets where digital sampling is highly done, there are a lot of concerns. If you read, there are a lot of people who do have worries about the sample, the representativeness. So can you share some of the things which are done by online data collection companies globally or in India, which will increase the data quality or improve the representativeness of the sample?
Absolutely, Josh. Brilliant question. And again, like Rag said, most of the sampling logics are driven by quota sampling is to be done in online, right? You always start with deciding where you want to go and who you want to pick. But there are a lot of data points that get captured in an online world, which basically gives more window into how people are behaving in an activity which is like answering a survey, right? So do people like to answer a survey in the mornings versus evenings? Do they like to answer a survey on an online PC or a tablet or a mobile phone? And we have done research where we know that there are differences on response rates, how people engage, whether they want to like to engage for 20-minute survey or an 8-minute survey, right? So these things are factors that you can actually control in an online world, not possible in an offline world. Apart from that, you can also use the context of the respondent, where you gather a lot of passive data and understand, okay, this guy is a user, this guy is a user of a ride-sharing app, this guy orders more often than not from a particular food-based app. And you can use that context into your sampling criteria. You can say, okay, I want to send out surveys for a particular topic only to a certain segment beyond your age, gender, region criteria that you would use. So best practices are definitely to ask a lot of questions to your sample provider. What all you can give, what all you can provide, what are the learnings of the sample which has come from online project A versus the same client would have done another project. Can you create a repository? Can you make that as a learning document that, okay, all my respondents have come from the same sampling frame year on year or week on week.
Okay.
And then obviously you use the financial industry guardrails on know your customer, right? You ask them to validate their mobile phone. It is easily doable. You ask them to validate their email ID. You ask them to capture the geographical location continuously. And you learn from the ICICI banks and the Googles of the world to understand how do you kind of create that authenticity layer of a respondent who's coming on a screen, which you can't see, is answering the way they should answer.
Good. These are, I think, one very important point Dushyant has raised, which it's not just about access panels, but let's say if you have, let's say if you're doing work, let's say for a client who's in the digital space, let's say online e-commerce or let's say a cab aggregator, imagine the kind of variables you have which you can use to sample. I mean, let's say F2F marketer would never know so much of behavior, but let's say a cab aggregator like a Uber or Ola can actually sample to the extent of heaviness, where the cabs are used, and you can actually sample based on behavior to investigate other issues like attitudes, etc. Before we open up to the audience, Rags, just one, I think, important point. In your experience, how do you see, there's sampling error and there's non-sampling error. How do you see, what is your learning about the impact these two have relatively on, let's say, on data quality or finally on, let's say, business decisions?
You know my views, Josh. I wish I had preserved the methodology book of the first national readership study done in this country, some 40,000 sample size, single largest study done around 77, 78 period. ORG used to have this book, and it used to be literally the volume on methodology used to be in GP's room, GPAT Sardi's room. So as young trainees, we'll have to go and pick it up and read it. So when we read that ORG's readership study, I was working on a campaign for Lintas at that time in terms of looking at media choices for them and profiling. So I went through that book. So I read the methodology book. Somewhere around the 4th page, there is a lovely graph. It has 3 vertical bars, and one bar said, and the instructions were step 1, look at the all India level, which is what I was looking at. Look at the all India level and look at the readership of your chosen publication. Let's say Hindu, and I looked up and I found that the readership of the chosen publication at an all India level was some 1.24% or something like that. And it said now on the first bar, put that 1.24% dot. Now, what is the sample at that level that you were looking at? Sample was some 40,000. So put a second dot, which was the sample size bar. So you put a dot there, join these two, and it will take you to the third bar where it will intersect the third bar, and that is your sampling error on that thing. Can any of you guess what was the sampling error on a 1.something% with a sample size of 30,000-40,000? It is in second decimals, third decimals, tiny sampling error. It could be 1.24, could be plus minus 0.00, some perfect sampling as per all theories are concerned. In the same book, 2 pages down, there is a heading called non-sampling error. Till then, I didn't know what non-sampling error was. The non-sampling error, it says non-sampling errors are extremely difficult to estimate. And a group of researchers attempted to estimate the non-sampling errors in that study. So which is basically a group of researchers estimate non-sampling errors. Later I learned is a whole series of mistakes that researchers make. And so you can see a body of researchers.
So I think Rags, what you're really saying is the impact, what your experience is also mine. The impact of non-sampling error is possibly much higher.
Huge.
Than what
6-7% was what was said.
Sampling is important, but I think we do need to pay attention to that.
Huge amount of non-sampling
Right, we'll now
error,
open it up to the audience. Questions, observations, critique, whatever you wish to say. Uh, uh, I don't know whether sampling is dead, but at least discussion on sampling is very much alive. And I think lots of more stuff we could have said. But I think let's go immediately to the question and answer. So let me look at that. So Priya, are you going to, or will I go through the questions? Okay, let's look at the first one from Jaideep Dhaur. One of the limitations of online panels is not getting representation of lower NCCS consumers. How do you see this getting addressed in the future? Dushyant, quick one on this.
Oh, sorry, I was reading the questions myself and enjoying the questions. Can you repeat that?
Yeah,
question
the first one, one of the limitation is not getting of online panels, not getting enough lower NCCS consumers.
True.
How do you see this getting addressed in the future?
True. So we all know online will not represent the market. Offline will not represent the higher SEC income groups. We all know that because of the gatekeepers, the new gatekeepers that are there now. The way it will get addressed is that today India is 50% population is accessing online medium, right? This is the latest number. In four years time, it will become 75%. I'm including urban and rural both. The entire 900 million number is the one that is being quoted as people who would be usually going online for a lot of activities, not just booking a railway ticket, which used to be the case 10 years back. So that itself will take care of the representation problem. But online will never say it represents everything. Like Rags mentioned, idea is that online will become the go-to medium, just like what we have seen in the developed world, where it changed over to phone and then phone, it became online. Now the generation is that the smartphone are allowing internet access across the various segments, and it is going to become online. There is no way it will go offline even after the pandemic is over.
In fact, a lot of the questions are on, ability to include lower NCCS. I mean, you can't. I mean, they're not online. You can't. So you can still do something what is called a mixed mode or a hybrid, and those work perfectly well. There's no issue there.
I have
yes, Rex. Go ahead.
2 points. One is, I think if you actually search through the consumer panel data, where you also track consumption, my experience is the top 50% of the population, which is predominantly online today, on an household panel would be tracking at 70% of all India consumption of basic items. And if you overlap luxury items and all of that stuff, which is basically in the online world today, you can literally track 80% of consumption. Yeah, there is a 20% of consumption which is still in the offline world, which is not available. What I foresee as a future that's going to happen will be a hybrid model, more of online plus telephone or a mobile, rather than online and offline kind of a thing is what I foresee as a future shape of things come. Because telephone penetration, mobile phone penetration is nearly knocking at 80%, 90% soon.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take the last question, and this is really in a way also summarize. I think it's a different kind. I think it's a very good question from Mr. S.T. Kalaraj. Great. Still, scientific method of sampling is still done very less, often as we compromise on client's response or of convenience. How to come out of the vicious cycle. Okay, let me just end with, I think, a perspective over here. I think, yes, it's good that that concern has been voiced. And I think what is important is it's not, the objective of sampling, good sampling is to represent the target group. But that's not the end. The end is that it should not actually mislead or give such a bias that the business takes a different call, right? Which it should have. And that's really the important point. Just representativeness for the sake of it can be an academic thing. It should not actually impact the business call you're taking in a wrong way. Let's give a very brief example. You want to find out how many people, let's say, consume, bottled soft drinks at home versus outside. And if you're doing a home-to-home sampling and you leave out a huge number of people who are not at home, you actually underestimate the people who are not. So there's a direct relationship between that and what you're measuring. And this is what also we have found. It's not that, I think what Nitesh said in the beginning, I think how much emphasis we give to sampling or the rigor of sampling will depend on the objective and the study. So if you look at measurement studies, what we discussed, like which are the lifeblood of consumer companies like retail audit or panel, it's extremely important that it's representative because you're actually extrapolating, projecting data, you're taking tough business decisions on that, on growths, etc. They have to be right. But if you are, let's say, on the other hand, doing a product test, it is perfectly fine to do, to let's say do quota sampling by heaviness of consumption and go to light, medium, heavy and do that. And you don't have to have quote unquote a market representative survey to see whether product A is better than product B. There are other instances where we have seen recently, let's say, some of the opinion polls, those who follow them in US and the UK have gone off. And when they investigated, they found that sampling was actually one of the variables which affected the result. So let's say even though it's in the US presidential election, for instance, Trump's vote was actually underestimated, the popular vote. And one of the reasons, which one of the research I read, was that there was a relationship between response rate of Democrats versus Republicans. So Democrats were more likely to respond to opinion polls than a Republican. So if that happens, then obviously what you're measuring and what is the sampling is intertwined and you get a bias. So it's not that there is no, at all, sampling is not going to die. That's something which you can assure those who support sampling. It's just that I think we have to put in the right perspective. It's horses for courses. There is a place where you need it. It should not by itself delay the project when you really need findings day before yesterday. And at the same time, you should not compromise on it when the rigor is required. Right? So I think with that, I think what we can say, sampling is dead, long live sampling. I think, let's say resurrect sampling. I think the digital data is giving us a huge opportunity to actually improve the sampling, use many more variables which we could never even think of in the brick and mortar world.